Welcome to the tragic and mysterious story of the cursed king, Ferdinand VII of Spain. A king who faced not only challenges of power, but also a horrific physical deformity that haunted his entire life. Today, we'll dive deep into Ferdinand VII's life, where power, shame, and fear combined to create one of the most heartbreaking stories in royal history. Join me as we go through this tragic journey. The year is 1834, and Madrid is gripped by a strange stillness. The grand halls of the royal palace, usually filled with the hum of courtiers and the lavish sounds of the Spanish court, now stand eerily quiet. It is not just the regular humdrum of daily life that has ceased. A shadow has fallen over the palace. King Ferdinand VII, the man who has ruled Spain for decades with an iron fist, is dead. But as the royal physician, your work is far from finished. You have been summoned to a private chamber, deep within the royal palace, by Queen Regent Maria Cristina. Her eyes are red, filled with a mixture of sorrow and fear, and as you approach her, you know something is amiss. Her hands tremble as she speaks, and her voice cracks with emotion. It is not his face that matters now, doctor. It is what lies beneath. As you approach Ferdinand's deathbed, you feel the oppressive weight of history bearing down on you. His body lies still under the royal silks, but the thought of what you are about to see fills you with dread. You try to steady your hands as you begin to lift the covers. You already know that Ferdinand's reign was defined by cruelty, paranoia, and betrayal, but what you are about to witness is a grotesque manifestation of these very traits, one that could never be publicly acknowledged during his life. The thing that lies beneath the silken sheets is something no royal physician has ever dared to write about, something that has been the subject of whispered rumors, but never openly discussed: Ferdinand's enormous, bizarrely shaped anatomy. For years, it has been an object of fascination and ridicule within the palace. It is the physical embodiment of a king who, despite his vast power, was plagued by a profound, private shame, a source of humiliation that became a twisted pride. The court has long known of the anatomical anomaly that ruled Ferdinand's life. His body, a product of centuries of inbreeding within the Spanish royal family, had been warped by the sins of his ancestors. And it is this very abnormality, one that could never be acknowledged in royal circles, that will now shape your role in history. You are tasked not only with preserving his body for eternity, but also, in a strange and almost unfathomable way, preserving the legacy of a king whose reign and life were tainted by a grotesque and tragic physical defect. As you begin the preservation process, your mind drifts. The corridors of the palace, once filled with the echoes of royal grandeur, are now a silent witness to the bizarre nature of Ferdinand's existence. The courtiers, the servants, and even the physicians themselves have all heard the stories of special cushions, of the screams of wives trapped in an unholy marriage, of the desperation to produce an heir despite nature's cruel joke. These whispers have passed through the walls of the palace, reverberating down the ages. But now, you are no longer just a physician. You are witness to something far greater, something that defies explanation. You are about to preserve a part of history that has been hidden away in the shadows of royal secrecy. And in doing so, you will become part of a story that will never be fully told, but whose echoes will haunt the annals of Spain for centuries to come. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand the cursed legacy of his bloodline. His birth was not merely the result of royal matrimony, but a dark and twisted product of centuries of genetic experimentation within the Spanish royal family. The Habsburgs and Bourbons, whose family trees had been intertwined for generations, had long practiced the dangerous art of royal inbreeding. Their marriages, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, were arranged not for love, but for the consolidation of power. This genetic lottery was rigged, and Ferdinand was destined to pay the price. Born on October 14, 1784, at the Royal El Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. Their marriage, like so many before them, was not the union of two souls but a political alliance, a strategic maneuver to strengthen the Bourbon dynasty. The price of this union, however, was clear from the very beginning. Ferdinand was born into a world where the legacy of inbreeding had already started to bear fruit, a twisted combination of physical deformities and psychological instability. As a child, Ferdinand was unaware of the true cost of his royal lineage. The spoils of his family's inbreeding began to manifest in subtle, disturbing ways. He was often sickly, and his physical development did not mirror the healthy vigor expected of future kings. It wasn't just his frailty that set him apart. It was the oddities that plagued his body, particularly in his later years, as his adult form began to reveal the tragic effects of royal genetics. The most prominent of these oddities was the one that would define Ferdinand's life: his anatomical abnormality. Early medical records, hidden for generations in Vatican archives, tell of a young prince whose body grew in strange and unsettling ways. By the time he reached adolescence, his physical condition had become a subject of whispered conversation among court physicians. His member, growing in both size and peculiarity, was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was described in clinical terms, though the horror of its dimensions could not be denied. A physician from the court, in one of his more candid writings, described Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality in unnervingly clinical terms. His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging. Another account, more blunt in its honesty, referred to it as a billiard cue thick at its base, tapering at the top with an odd curvature and ample length. For Ferdinand, this abnormality was more than just a physical oddity. It was a profound source of shame. In an era where aristocratic men were expected to uphold ideals of refinement and restraint, his grotesque body marked him as a freak of nature. The standards of masculine beauty were harsh. In a world where Greek statues and classical sculptures were revered, Ferdinand's physical reality became the ultimate humiliation. The very thing that modern men might secretly envy became, for Ferdinand, the focal point of mockery, of ridicule, and, most tragically, of self-loathing. But it wasn't just his body that was a source of pain for the young prince. His childhood was shaped by dysfunction and betrayal, the dual forces that would carve his path into history. His father, King Charles IV, was weak-willed and preoccupied with his personal pleasures, favoring hunting over wood. His mother, Maria Louisa, displayed a voracious appetite for life, openly flaunting her affair with Manuel de Godoy, the de facto ruler of Spain. Ferdinand was exposed daily to this degradation, this marriage of convenience, this toxic royal union, and he absorbed its lessons. That power was fragile, that trust could be easily broken, and that the human body, even one destined for kingship, could be the source of profound misery. But it was the nature of his body, his most intimate self, that would come to dominate his world. The court, ever so adept at whispering behind closed doors, had begun to murmur about the prince's condition. His very existence seemed to mock the classical ideals of masculinity, which had defined the aristocracy for centuries. Even the servants, the lowest of the low in the royal court, would exchange whispers behind their hands, giggling at the young prince's condition. Diplomats who came to Spain would report back to their governments, not just about the political machinations of the royal court, but about the singular embarrassment that Ferdinand represented. It was no longer just Ferdinand's body that was under scrutiny. It was his very identity, his sense of worth, his dignity. As the prince grew older, the shame became suffocating. Ferdinand learned to distrust everyone around him. His family, his courtiers, even his tutors. They were all, in his mind, witnesses to his shame. And as his body grew ever more grotesque, so too did his paranoia. Ferdinand's early experiences marked the beginning of his transformation. He learned that being royal was not a privilege. It was a curse. A curse that had been passed down through generations, written in the blood of his ancestors. The physical deformities, the ridicule, the isolation, it was all part of the price of power. And as the young Ferdinand grew into adulthood, he would become a man who would stop at nothing to hide his body from the world, even if it meant destroying everything around him in the process. As Ferdinand VII entered his teenage years, the grotesque anomaly of his body became increasingly impossible to ignore. What had once been a subtle oddity became more pronounced, and the whispers within the palace grew louder. It wasn't just the medical professionals who noticed the change. Everyone from the courtiers to the servants, and even foreign dignitaries, soon became aware of the prince's condition. What had started as a curiosity became a profound embarrassment, and Ferdinand was forced to confront the painful truth that his body had become a spectacle, a source of mockery rather than admiration. The prince's early years, though sheltered within the confines of the royal palace, had not been kind. From an early age, his life had been one of quiet suffering. Surrounded by a court that valued appearance above all else, Ferdinand was made keenly aware of his difference. The aristocracy, particularly in Spain, had long adhered to an almost obsessive cult of beauty, both in character and in appearance. To be seen as flawed in either regard was a tragedy in itself. And for Ferdinand, this flaw was physical, and so painfully obvious. While he struggled with the humiliation of his condition, Ferdinand's personality began to take shape in reaction to the cruel treatment he endured. The boy who had once been somewhat gentle, inquisitive, and charming became withdrawn, paranoid, and vindictive. He harbored a deep-seated resentment toward everyone who seemed to enjoy life's pleasures without his suffering. His family, the courtiers, and even the common people of Spain who, he imagined, would find humor in his plight. He began to view the world through the lens of his deformity, convinced that everyone around him was secretly laughing at him. What had once been a relatively innocent childhood had now transformed into a landscape of distrust and bitterness. Ferdinand's growing resentment was not only confined to those around him but began to manifest in his own psyche. He was no longer just ashamed of his physical form. He became obsessed with it, fixated on it. The secretive glances and whispered conversations around him only served to deepen his isolation. In an attempt to maintain some semblance of control, he became ruthless in his treatment of anyone he deemed disrespectful or untrustworthy. If a servant happened to glance at him in a way that suggested mockery, the punishment was swift and severe. Dismissal, punishment, or even exile. His rule, though in its infancy, had already begun to take shape in the form of retribution. The damage done to Ferdinand's psyche in these formative years could never be undone. But it was not just his growing paranoia that would shape his future. It was the sense of powerlessness that followed him throughout his life. Even as a prince, he knew that he was physically incapable of fulfilling his royal duties as expected. He was supposed to be the symbol of masculinity, of strength and virility. But instead, he became an embodiment of everything the royal family was meant to hide. His anatomy, once an innocent development, had turned into a cruel twist of fate, one that could not be ignored. And yet, despite his misery, Ferdinand did not remain passive. He learned how to wield the power of his position to mask the shame he felt. By the time he reached adulthood, Ferdinand had perfected the art of cruelty, using his royal status to dominate those around him. His subjects, his courtiers, even his tutors, they all came to understand that Ferdinand's kindness had disappeared long ago, replaced by a need to control everything and everyone. The king's wrath could strike at any moment, whether for an innocent misstep or a perceived slight, and Ferdinand began to rule with an iron fist, creating an atmosphere of fear and compliance at the palace. His behaviors became more erratic, and his temper more volatile. Ferdinand's relationships with his tutors, who had once tried to guide him, became increasingly strained. His tutors noticed that he no longer behaved as a curious young man interested in learning. Instead, He became bitter, sullen, and confrontational. His demeanor hardened, and he began using his power to punish those who disrespected him in the smallest ways. One particular incident stands out in the memoirs of a court chaplain, and it reveals the growing darkness within Ferdinand's soul. A young page, unaware of Ferdinand's growing volatility, accidentally walked in on the prince while he was changing clothes. The punishment was swift and severe. Rather than simply dismissing the boy from the room, Ferdinand ordered him to be flogged. Not only that, but the page's entire family was exiled from Madrid, never to return. The message was clear. Ferdinand would not tolerate humiliation of any kind, and anyone who dared to witness his shame would pay the price. But it wasn't just the people around him who suffered. Ferdinand's own sense of self-worth was crumbling under the weight of his deformity, and as he moved closer to marriageable age, he realized the true extent of the difficulty he would face in producing an heir. The pressures of producing a royal heir, of fulfilling his duty to the Spanish throne, now seemed insurmountable. He was a king in name only, and even that title felt like a hollow echo. His body had betrayed him, and in the eyes of the court, it would forever be the defining characteristic of his reign. As Ferdinand approached adulthood, it became apparent that his marriage would be far from a fairy tale. It would be an ordeal, one that he would face with the same deep-seated fear and paranoia that had defined his life so far. It wasn't just a matter of finding a suitable bride. It was a matter of finding someone who would be able to endure the unique challenges Ferdinand's body presented. And the more he thought about this, the more Ferdinand realized that no one could possibly understand the depth of his suffering, not even his future wife. The next chapters of his life would be dominated by this obsession. Marriage would not be a union of love or mutual respect. It would be a battleground. And as Ferdinand stepped into adulthood, he was already prepared to fight not just for the throne, but for the one thing that had eluded him for years: a child. But what he didn't know yet was that this journey would be fraught with even greater psychological torment and personal tragedy. And at the center of it all, his physical anomaly would continue to haunt him, transforming his every decision into an agonizing reminder of his own inadequacies. As Ferdinand's adolescence passed, the mental and emotional toll of his condition deepened. His paranoia, once a quiet undercurrent to his life, began to swell into an all-consuming force. He had already experienced the cruelty of his physical deformity, how it made him the object of whispered gossip and cruel jokes. But now it was something more than a source of shame. It was a prison. Ferdinand's condition had not only cursed him physically but also psychologically, shaping the very fabric of his identity and the way he interacted with the world. In a time when masculinity was defined by idealized strength, virility, and sexual prowess, Ferdinand's body became a grotesque mirror of all that he was not. Where others exuded confidence, elegance, and grace, Ferdinand could only be reminded of his difference. And yet, this deep-rooted sense of shame and fear transformed him into a man who could never feel truly secure. His position as a future king did little to soothe his inner turmoil. Rather, it only magnified the sense of inadequacy he felt every time he looked in a mirror. Ferdinand's paranoia began to seep into his relationships, most notably with his family and closest confidants. He became convinced that the world was out to mock him, that even those who were closest to him saw him as a freak. He couldn't shake the feeling that people were always whispering behind his back, judging his every move. His servants, the courtiers, even the ministers, no one seemed beyond suspicion. Ferdinand could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was a product of his delusions. His fears consumed him, shaping every decision he made, every interaction he had, and every moment of his reign. The court, once a place of high diplomacy and graceful manners, became a theater of fear and suspicion under Ferdinand's rule. Those who served him knew that one careless word, one wrong gesture, could cost them everything. And yet, as they tiptoed around their king, they could not help but notice the signs of his growing instability. His once subtle fears had now turned into active hostility. Ferdinand no longer cared to conceal his animosity. It was out in the open for everyone to see. One day, as the prince sat in the royal gardens, observing the courtiers who passed by, he overheard a pair of them speaking in hushed tones. At first, Ferdinand dismissed it as idle chatter. But then his ears caught the unmistakable sound of laughter. The laughter that he had feared for so long. He clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. What had been an innocent conversation between two servants now felt like a direct assault on his dignity. In that moment, Ferdinand's paranoia reached new heights. The courtiers who had once seemed harmless now became enemies, and their laughter felt like a venomous insult to his very being. Ferdinand's reaction was swift and extreme. The servants involved were brought before him, their heads bowed in fear. They had not known the prince had overheard them, nor could they have predicted his wrath. They were dismissed from the palace immediately, exiled from Madrid without so much as a chance to explain themselves. Ferdinand, in his mind, had taken the necessary steps to preserve his dignity, but in reality, his actions had only fueled the atmosphere of fear that began to surround him. But the paranoia didn't stop with servants. It began to bleed into his relationship with his family, particularly his parents. His father, King Charles IV, was too weak to control the kingdom, preferring hunting and leisure over the demands of ruling. Ferdinand watched as his father's apathy not only weakened the monarchy, but, in his eyes, allowed Spain to be ridiculed on the world stage. Yet, even more frustrating to him was the fact that his mother, Maria Luisa, flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's de facto ruler. To Ferdinand, this behavior was not just humiliating, it was an affront to the very foundation of the monarchy. From the outside, Ferdinand's disdain for his parents may have appeared as a reflection of political differences, but to him, it was much deeper. His parents' actions, or lack thereof, seemed to mock his suffering, reinforcing his sense of inferiority. Every time he looked at his father's weak rule or his mother's affair, Ferdinand saw a reflection of his own inadequacy. His own father, whose genetic legacy had given birth to such deformity in his son, was now a source of disdain. The growing tension between Ferdinand and his parents reached a breaking point as he entered his late teens. In the privacy of his chambers, he began to develop a deep resentment for their perceived neglect. They had allowed Spain to become a kingdom in disarray, a mirror image of his own personal dysfunction. As the years passed, Ferdinand's mistrust of his family grew, and soon, his animosity took on darker forms. One incident, in particular, stands out, a key turning point in Ferdinand's psychological decline. During a royal banquet, Ferdinand overheard a conversation between his father and a foreign diplomat. The subject of the conversation was Spain's future, and the diplomat made a passing comment about Ferdinand's impending marriage, joking about the prince's future wife needing to be prepared for certain royal difficulties. The laughter that followed shook Ferdinand to his core. He had never been more humiliated, and in his mind, it was not just the diplomat's words that hurt him, it was the fact that his own family had allowed such a comment to be made at all. The laughter, the whispered jokes, the knowing glances. Ferdinand became convinced that they were all part of a coordinated campaign to humiliate him. He began to see enemies everywhere. The walls of his palace were no longer filled with the sounds of laughter and celebration. They echoed with the whispers of mockery and ridicule. Ferdinand had not just become the king of Spain. He had become a paranoid tyrant who would stop at nothing to protect his royal dignity, no matter the cost. The man who once might have been a ruler of wisdom and strength was now a king whose every action was dictated by a deep and unrelenting fear of his own inadequacy. The mounting pressure to produce an heir was just the beginning. Ferdinand's condition, both physical and psychological, would now shape the trajectory of his reign. And in the end, it would be his obsession with protecting his dignity that would destroy everything in its path. As Ferdinand's psychological state worsened, his physical condition continued to plague him. becoming an ever-present reminder of his inadequacies. It was no longer just a matter of shame. It was a constant battle for control over his body and his legacy. His obsession with finding a solution to his condition led him into the hands of a shadowy network of court physicians, alchemists, and dubious medical specialists. These figures, who had long served the royal family, were now tasked with the impossible: to fix what nature had so cruelly given him. The court physicians, who had once enjoyed the luxury of treating ordinary maladies, now found themselves in the midst of a medical nightmare. Ferdinand's condition was a well-kept secret in the royal chambers, discussed only in hushed tones behind closed doors. Those who dared to bring it up in public were swiftly silenced, their careers ruined. The physicians knew that their continued employment depended on finding some kind of solution to Ferdinand's unique problem, but they also knew the futility of their task. No medical treatment, no matter how sophisticated, could resolve the grotesque anomaly of the king's body. But Ferdinand, desperate and paranoid, was unwilling to accept failure. He demanded solutions, even when they seemed more like dark rituals than actual remedies. His court became a haven for quacks, mystics, and charlatans from across Europe, all of whom promised to restore his masculinity and fix his marital troubles. The king's desperation made him an easy mark for anyone who claimed to have the answer. From potions made from powdered rhinoceros horn to bizarre herbal concoctions from remote corners of the world, Ferdinand spared no expense in his search for a cure. Yet, each treatment proved to be nothing more than a false hope, a temporary escape from his unrelenting reality. Despite these failures, Ferdinand continued to seek out new remedies. He was convinced that his condition was a curse, and that only the most mystical and powerful forces could undo what had been done to him. His obsession with finding the right treatment soon consumed him completely. He no longer trusted his physicians, but instead turned to alchemists who promised him a magical cure, one that would restore his body to its rightful form. Among these so-called experts was a mysterious figure from the East, a supposed alchemist from the Orient who arrived in Madrid under the cover of darkness. This man, who claimed to possess knowledge that had been passed down through generations of secret scholars, convinced Ferdinand that his condition was not the result of a physical flaw but a divine test. The alchemist proposed a series of rituals involving incense, chants, and mystical symbols, all designed to align the king's essence and restore balance to his body. Ferdinand, desperate for any sign of relief, eagerly agreed to undergo these strange ceremonies. For months, he subjected himself to these rituals, convinced that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The court was soon filled with the strange sounds of incantations and the pungent smell of burning herbs. His physicians, who had been relegated to the sidelines, watched in disbelief as their king sank deeper into the grip of superstition. But even these arcane practices failed to provide any lasting relief. Ferdinand's condition remained the same, grotesque and unyielding, and his paranoia intensified. His mental state, already fragile, began to crack under the pressure. He became obsessed with the idea that his failure to produce an heir was not just a result of his physical condition, but a conspiracy. He believed that the entire court was in on it, that everyone around him was secretly mocking him, and that even his own body was betraying him. This deepening paranoia led to a new, darker phase in Ferdinand's relationship with his physicians. He demanded complete secrecy from them, threatening to dismiss or punish anyone who dared speak of his condition outside the royal chambers. His once trusted physicians were now reduced to mere puppets, performing whatever rituals and experiments the king demanded, no matter how bizarre or unscientific they might be. One such experiment, which became infamous in the annals of royal history, involved a specially designed medical device. Ferdinand, convinced that his condition could only be remedied with the right apparatus, ordered the royal craftsman to create what he called marital aids. These devices were crafted in secret, away from the prying eyes of the court, and were designed to help Ferdinand achieve his royal duty without causing harm to his future wives. The craftsman, who had once created only the finest royal furnishings and ceremonial objects, were now tasked with creating devices that seemed more suited to a madman's obsession than a king's needs. These custom-made cushions, supports, and implements were designed to assist Ferdinand in his intimate encounters, but even the finest craftsmen could not create a solution to his anatomical nightmare. The designs grew more complex and disturbing with each iteration, each device more elaborate than the last. Despite these grotesque efforts, Ferdinand's obsession with his body only deepened. He became consumed with the idea that the key to his success as a king, and as a man, lay in the perfect alignment of his body with his royal duties. He would spend hours with his physicians, scrutinizing every detail of his treatment and demanding that each new remedy be tried and tested, no matter how absurd. But even as he immersed himself in this dark world of medical experimentation, Ferdinand could not escape the realization that his body was a prison. No matter how many physicians he consulted, no matter how many alchemists he summoned, he would never be free of the shame and torment that his physical form imposed upon him. And so, Ferdinand's court became a place not just of royal intrigue and political maneuvering, but of psychological torture and medical futility. The once celebrated royal physicians now found themselves in a trap of their own, bound by the king's obsessive demands and the realization that they could do nothing to solve his greatest challenge. They, too, had become pawns in Ferdinand's twisted quest for power and dignity, trapped by their own complicity in the king's delusions. The royal palace, once a symbol of Spain's grandeur, had become a haunted house of mirrors, reflecting not just Ferdinand's tortured soul, but the fragile, decaying empire that he was struggling to hold together. As Spain's power waned on the international stage, Ferdinand's personal struggles became an increasingly grotesque symbol of the dysfunction that plagued the kingdom. And yet, despite the mounting evidence that Ferdinand's reign was a disaster, the royal family and the court remained bound to him, forced to sustain the myth of his authority. As Ferdinand's condition worsened, his hopes of producing an heir became a consuming obsession. His first marriage, to Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, was arranged when both were still teenagers. The match was political, part of the continuing web of royal inbreeding that had plagued Ferdinand's family for generations. When Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid, she was filled with romantic notions of royal life, as any young princess might be. She had heard whispers of the king's charisma and his potential for greatness. But little did she know that her union with Ferdinand would set the stage for a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The wedding ceremony itself was a grand affair, as befitted the union of two royal houses. The cathedral echoed with music, and the streets of Madrid were filled with the celebrations of a union that was meant to solidify Spain's political standing. To the public, the marriage appeared to be a fairy tale, two beautiful, young royals coming together in the name of love and diplomacy. But as with most royal marriages, the public celebration hid the darker truth. Maria Antonia had been prepared for the role of wife, but not for the horrors that awaited her in the royal chambers. She had been told little about the realities of married life, and nothing about the specific challenges Ferdinand's body would present. The most intimate aspects of royal marriages were discussed only in vague terms by nervous older women, leaving the young princess woefully unprepared. As the night of the wedding arrived, the excitement of the day faded into the terrifying reality of what was to come. Ferdinand, who had spent years obsessing over his condition, now faced the moment that would define his future as a king and a husband. He knew that producing an heir was crucial, yet his physical anomaly made the task impossible without careful preparation. As a result, Ferdinand had arranged for an unusual setup in their bridal chamber. Special cushions, oils, and implements were brought in, all designed to mitigate the horrors of the king's deformity. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, had no idea what awaited her. When she stepped into the chamber that night, she was filled with anticipation, her heart racing with thoughts of the future, of love, and of her royal duty. But what greeted her was not the romantic, tender night she had imagined. Instead, she was met with Ferdinand's grotesque, twisted body. a form that no amount of royal training could have prepared her to understand. When Maria Antonia first glimpsed her husband's naked form, she was horrified. The description of Ferdinand's anatomy is chilling. It was large, misshapen, and utterly alien to the young bride. One lady-in-waiting later recalled the scene in graphic detail. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself, she wrote. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. The sheer size of Ferdinand's abnormality was enough to send Maria Antonia into a state of shock, but it was the bizarre shape, curved and lumpy, almost as if unnatural, that pushed her over the edge. The very sight of it was enough to break her composure. This wasn't the man she had been promised. This was something monstrous, something that defied reason. She had never been prepared for the reality of what her marriage would entail, and what followed was less a wedding night and more a grotesque medical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians were summoned to the royal bedchamber to help Maria Antonia navigate the night's ordeal. They were not there to offer comfort or to guide the couple through a romantic union. Instead, they were there to ensure that the king could perform his royal duty without causing harm to his wife. The process was clinical, impersonal, and entirely devoid of any semblance of affection. Specially designed cushions were arranged to support Ferdinand's abnormality, and oils were applied to ensure that the night's intimate ritual could proceed without injury. Maria Antonia, terrified and overwhelmed by the entire experience, required heavy doses of laudanum to endure the trauma of what was happening. The medication was meant to make her compliant, but it also left her numb to the reality of her situation. For Ferdinand, the night was one of both shame and frustration. Despite all the preparations, it was clear that producing an heir would not be as simple as he had hoped. The biological and psychological barriers were too great. As the night drew to a close, the king and queen retreated to their separate chambers, both broken by the experience, yet neither willing to face the full truth of what had occurred. For Maria Antonia, the psychological toll of the night's events was devastating. What was supposed to be a time of joy and bonding became a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The young queen soon began to exhibit signs of severe psychological distress. Court physicians recorded that she experienced hysterical episodes, a term that in today's language might be recognized as acute trauma responses. But the true extent of her suffering was never fully acknowledged. Instead, the court, Ferdinand included, saw her distress as a mere inconvenience to their royal duty. Ferdinand, for his part, grew increasingly obsessed with the idea of producing an heir. His desperation deepened with each failed attempt, and he became convinced that Maria Antonia's apparent revulsion was the reason they could not conceive. He accused her of being unwilling to fulfill her wifely duties, and in his delusional mind, he began to believe that she was somehow sabotaging his attempts to secure a future for Spain. Rather than showing empathy for his wife's trauma, Ferdinand's obsession with creating an heir led him to experiment with even more bizarre methods. Court records from the time reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints designed to hold Maria Antonia in place during their intimate encounters. These restraints, crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles, were meant to prevent Maria Antonia from escaping the royal bedchamber. The fact that these devices were created at all speaks to the depths of Ferdinand's delusion, his inability to grasp the true nature of his situation. The repeated failures to produce an heir eventually led Ferdinand to consult astrologers and mystics, who promised to align the stars for him. He became obsessed with the idea that the key to his success lay not in his physical ability but in the proper alignment of celestial forces. He consulted with astronomers and even believed that astrological charts could predict the perfect time for conception. But even with all these elaborate preparations, Ferdinand's anxiety continued to mount. The tension between him and Maria Antonia grew unbearable. For the queen, the strain of these ritualized encounters left her emotionally and physically exhausted. She began taking larger and larger doses of laudanum to escape the reality of her marriage. What was once a young woman filled with dreams of her royal future had been reduced to a shell, a woman trapped in a world of torment, all for the sake of fulfilling a royal duty that seemed impossible. As the years passed, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir deepened. Yet, despite all the medical interventions, mystic rituals, and emotional manipulation, the king was left with nothing but failure and despair. The tragedy of his reign lay not only in his inability to provide an heir, but in the psychological and emotional toll that this failure took on everyone around him. His first marriage, meant to secure the future of the Spanish dynasty, had become a tragic story of love, power, and loss. Ferdinand's first marriage, with its tragic failures and psychological devastation, had only one remaining purpose in his eyes: producing a legitimate heir to the throne. His growing obsession with this goal began to define every aspect of his reign. The failure to produce an heir was not just a personal defeat, it was a blow to the legitimacy of his reign, a shame that gnawed at his very identity as king. As the years passed without a son, Ferdinand's desperation began to take on a fevered intensity, and his obsession grew more consuming. In his mind, the kingdom was at risk. His lack of a male heir was not just a personal failure. It threatened to unravel everything that the Spanish monarchy stood for. The Spanish throne, a symbol of power, was bound to the future of his bloodline. And with each passing year, Ferdinand's sense of duty became twisted into an all-encompassing need to prove his worth as king, as a man, and as a ruler. To him, producing an heir had become the singular objective of his reign. Everything else, the political turmoil, the suffering of his people, and the decline of the Spanish Empire, paled in comparison to the burden of securing the dynasty. Ferdinand's growing anxiety over the failure to produce a male heir led to bizarre and extreme actions. His court became a strange laboratory of medical experimentation, with the king relentlessly pursuing ever more outlandish solutions to his dilemma. He turned to foreign physicians, alchemists, and even mystics, all promising miracle cures or miraculous solutions. His mind was no longer focused on ruling the kingdom. It was focused solely on restoring his masculinity and securing the future of the monarchy. But none of these attempts brought success. The medical treatments continued to fail, and the elaborate marital devices that Ferdinand had commissioned proved inadequate to the task. He became convinced that his problem lay not in his own body, but in his wife's unwillingness to comply. Maria Antonia's refusal to conceive, in Ferdinand's mind, could only mean one thing: her body was rejecting his royal seed. He became convinced that her body was somehow sabotaging his attempts, and this belief fueled an ever-deepening resentment. The psychological toll of these years was disastrous for both Ferdinand and Maria Antonia. Ferdinand's unrelenting obsession with producing an heir had made their marriage a mechanical, clinical ordeal, devoid of love, passion, or even mutual respect. For Maria Antonia, the repeated failures and the king's increasing hostility drove her to the brink of madness. The doses of laudanum she took to endure the traumatic encounters became more frequent, and her health deteriorated under the constant stress of the royal duties and the psychological torment she endured. Ferdinand's increasing paranoia fueled a cruel interpretation of every action, every word, and every gesture. He believed his wife's reluctance was a direct betrayal, a refusal to fulfill her royal duties. In this, Ferdinand's narcissism and insecurity merged into a toxic cocktail of control and delusion. He had already experienced the humiliation of being mocked for his deformity, but now he was being humiliated by his inability to perform his most basic duty as king, to produce an heir. The king's mental state was deteriorating rapidly, and every failed attempt only deepened his resolve. He could not, would not, accept failure. In the midst of all this, Ferdinand's treatment of his wife became increasingly sadistic. He ordered the creation of elaborate restraints, leather straps and silk ropes, designed to hold Maria Antonia in place during their intimate encounters. These devices, crafted by the same artisans who created royal saddles, were made with the sole purpose of ensuring that she could not escape their marital duties. The restraints were intended to physically prevent her from moving away during intimate relations, a grotesque way to force compliance, and an explicit statement of Ferdinand's belief that he could control not only his body but also the body of his wife. But Maria Antonia was no longer the bright-eyed princess who had arrived in Madrid all those years ago. She had become a shell of the woman she once was, her health eroded by constant physical and emotional trauma. Her once innocent understanding of her royal duties had been warped into a nightmare she could neither escape nor understand. Her emotional state had deteriorated to such an extent that court physicians began to note her increasing dependence on laudanum, a drug she used to dull the pain of her existence. Ferdinand, obsessed with the idea that his failure was not only a personal shortcoming but a political crisis, began to distance himself from the reality of the situation. Instead of showing empathy or concern for his wife's deteriorating health, he became more fixated on his royal duty. His obsession with producing an heir overshadowed everything else, even the well-being of his wife. The very institution of marriage, which was supposed to unite a king and queen in mutual respect and love, had become a sterile, cold, and cruel experiment, a means to an end rather than a sacred bond. Ferdinand's desperation reached its peak when, after several years of failure, he consulted with a number of astrologers, mystics, and spiritual guides. They assured him that if he timed his attempts at procreation according to the lunar cycles and the stars, his fortunes might change. Ferdinand, ever the believer in superstitions and impossible cures, seized upon this advice and began to plan his attempts according to these celestial charts. Every detail of his intimate encounters was now calculated, as if they were part of a cosmic ritual to bring the Spanish crown into the hands of the future heir. But the failure continued. With every month that passed without a pregnancy, Ferdinand's despair grew. He was no longer just a king struggling to produce an heir. He had become a man consumed by fear and doubt. The kingdom that had once been the envy of Europe now seemed to falter under the weight of his obsession. A kingdom whose ruler was fixated on something far more intimate and personal than the future of his empire. As the days turned to years, Ferdinand's reign was marked not by grand achievements or victories, but by an ever-deepening spiral of obsession, anxiety, and failure. And yet, as the years stretched on, Ferdinand could not abandon the hope that somewhere, somehow, he would finally find a way to fulfill his royal duty. He refused to accept the truth that his physical condition had rendered him incapable of fathering an heir, and instead retreated deeper into his delusions, convinced that he was one step away from achieving his goal. The psychological cost of this obsession, however, would leave lasting scars on everyone involved, and the echoes of Ferdinand's desperation would reverberate throughout his entire reign. As the years wore on, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir continued unabated, but the consequences of his desperation began to take their toll not only on his wife, Maria Antonia, but also on his entire court. His efforts to force an heir into existence through ritual, manipulation, and psychological torment led to a tragic series of events that would only deepen the misery surrounding him. The miscarriage of Maria Antonia's pregnancies marked a turning point in their already broken marriage, one that would leave scars not just on her, but on Ferdinand's mental state as well. The first miscarriage occurred in 1804, a mere 4 months into the pregnancy. The palace, which had been filled with hope for a future heir, descended into a grim silence. Court physicians could offer no explanation for why the pregnancy had ended prematurely, but whispers spread quickly through the palace corridors. Some suggested that the physical and emotional trauma Maria Antonia endured as a result of her marital relationship with Ferdinand had contributed to the miscarriage. The pressure to conceive, combined with the trauma of her forced compliance during intimate relations, had been unbearable. The pain, both physical and psychological, had finally caught up with her. Ferdinand, who had hoped that this pregnancy would be the one to secure his legacy, was devastated by the loss, though not in the way that might be expected. His grief was not marked by compassion for his wife's suffering. Instead, he turned his frustration inward, convinced that the miscarriage was yet another failure, a reflection of his own inadequacy. His belief that the fault lay with Maria Antonia deepened. He convinced himself that her body was somehow rejecting his royal seed, that she was sabotaging their attempts to conceive out of spite or weakness. His already fragile mental state was further shattered by this loss, and his relationship with his wife became even more strained. The second miscarriage came in 1805, and this one was even more devastating than the first. Maria Antonia, who had carried the child almost a full term, suffered through a labor so difficult and bloody that it nearly cost her life. The court physicians scrambled to save her, but the damage had been done. The miscarriage was not just a personal tragedy for Ferdinand, it was a reminder of his greatest fear, that his body, that same body he had tried to control and manipulate, had doomed him to failure as a ruler and as a man. The miscarriage of a child who had almost been born was a cruel blow that not only robbed him of an heir, but also signaled the impossibility of achieving the one goal he had obsessed over for years. For Maria Antonia, the second miscarriage marked the point of no return. She had already suffered so much emotional and physical pain that her health began to deteriorate rapidly. The miscarriage, coupled with her ongoing dependence on laudanum to cope with the trauma of her marriage, left her a shell of the vibrant woman she had once been. She grew more and more withdrawn, spending her days in solitude, her mind consumed by the pain of her losses and the realization that her marriage to Ferdinand would never bring her peace. Yet even in her suffering, Ferdinand's obsession remained the driving force in their relationship. His mind, already fragile from years of emotional turmoil, began to deteriorate further as he became convinced that Maria Antonia's failures were not the result of her physical or emotional trauma, but the result of some deeper flaw in her character. He began to accuse her of deliberately sabotaging their attempts to conceive, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that prevented her from fulfilling her duty as queen. His accusations grew more paranoid, and his treatment of Maria Antonia became increasingly cruel. Rather than showing any sympathy or understanding for his wife's condition, Ferdinand subjected her to further psychological and physical torment. He believed that her refusal to conceive was not just a personal tragedy but an act of betrayal. In his mind, Maria Antonia was no longer just the queen. She was the embodiment of his own failure. And as this realization took root, his cruelty toward her became more pronounced. He demanded that she undergo more medical treatments, more rituals, and more invasive examinations in an attempt to correct the problem he believed lay within her body. Maria Antonia, already broken by years of psychological and physical abuse, could endure no more. Her addiction to laudanum deepened, and she began to spiral further into despair. Her health, both mental and physical, continued to decline until, in May 1807, she died at the age of just 21. The official cause of death was recorded as fever and complications from her delicate constitution, but those close to the queen knew the truth. Maria Antonia had died not just from a fever, but from the crushing weight of years spent under Ferdinand's cruel and obsessive control. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the court, but Ferdinand's reaction was not what one might expect. Instead of mourning the loss of his wife, he became convinced that she had been poisoned, not by political enemies, but by those closest to her. He suspected that she had been deliberately murdered by her own body, or perhaps by Ferdinand's own body, as if to punish him further for his inability to produce an heir. He even went so far as to accuse his own servants of being involved in a conspiracy to undermine his efforts to restore the royal bloodline. Rumors quickly began to spread about the true cause of Maria Antonia's death. Some whispered that Ferdinand had played a direct role in her demise, while others pointed to the psychological abuse she had suffered at his hands. The official cause of death, however, remained fever and exhaustion, terms that could not encompass the full depth of the horror that had occurred behind the palace walls. Ferdinand, now without a wife and without an heir, was left to face the aftermath of his own madness. His obsession with producing an heir, his cruel treatment of his wife, and his inability to accept the limitations of his body had destroyed everything he had hoped to build. But for Ferdinand, this tragedy was not enough. He could not accept the end of his dream, and so he began to prepare for his next marriage, determined that this time he would succeed where he had failed before. But little did he know that the psychological scars left by Maria Antonia's death would haunt him for the rest of his life, and that his quest for an heir would lead him down even darker paths. The death of Maria Antonia marked the beginning of a new, darker chapter in Ferdinand VII's life. The tragic demise of his first wife, combined with his unrelenting failure to produce an heir, had pushed the king to the brink of insanity. But rather than confronting the reality of his situation, Ferdinand retreated further into the abyss of delusion and paranoia. He became consumed by the belief that his inability to father a child was not a result of his own physical deformities, but a conspiracy orchestrated by his enemies, both within and outside the palace. In his eyes, everyone around him was either mocking his failure or working to prevent him from securing the future of Spain. He began to see betrayal in every action, even in the smallest of gestures. His courtiers, once trusted allies, were now viewed as potential traitors. His servants, who had long been loyal to the crown, were suspected of plotting against him. Ferdinand's paranoia spread like a disease throughout the royal court, infecting everyone he came into contact with. The most terrifying aspect of Ferdinand's paranoia was his belief that even his closest relatives, those who were supposed to be his supporters, were secretly conspiring against him. He grew increasingly distrustful of his family members, especially his father, Charles IV, and his mother, Maria Luisa. Ferdinand believed that their apparent indifference to his plight was not just a failure to support him, but a deliberate attempt to undermine his position as king. He became convinced that they were, in fact, part of a larger conspiracy to disgrace him, to weaken his claim to the throne, and to diminish his authority in the eyes of the Spanish people. As Ferdinand's paranoia deepened, so did his cruelty. He began to punish anyone he deemed a threat, regardless of whether they had actually done anything to provoke his wrath. The slightest infraction, the faintest hint of disrespect, was enough to send Ferdinand into a violent fury. He would summon his servants and court officials to his private chambers, where he would berate and threaten them with exile or worse. No one was safe from his growing madness, and the once thriving court of Spain became a place of fear, where whispers of treason and conspiracy filled the air. Ferdinand's obsession with maintaining control over his kingdom extended to the very walls of the palace. He ordered the construction of secret passageways throughout the royal residence, enabling him to move undetected from room to room, keeping his every move hidden from those he feared might be spying on him. These hidden corridors allowed him to monitor the activities of his court in secret, ensuring that no one could conspire against him without his knowledge. The palace, once a symbol of grandeur and royal elegance, had transformed into a maze of surveillance and distrust, a reflection of Ferdinand's increasingly fractured mind. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd levels. He ordered mirrors to be placed at strategic points in the palace so that he could watch his courtiers without them knowing. He had his servants search for hidden eavesdropping devices, convinced that his every conversation was being overheard by enemies within his own court. Even the simplest of activities, like a private conversation with his family or a casual meeting with a trusted advisor, became a potential threat to his rule. Ferdinand's paranoia had consumed him entirely, and no one, no matter how loyal, was above suspicion. As his paranoia deepened, Ferdinand began to develop an obsession with the idea that someone was trying to poison him. He ordered his food to be tested for toxins before each meal, insisting that every dish be tasted by a servant before he would touch it. The process of food tasting, once a simple formality, became a ritual of fear. The king insisted that the servants wait 30 minutes after sampling the food to ensure that any poison would take effect before he ate. Some of the royal staff, exhausted by the constant surveillance and suspicion, began to collapse under the pressure. Their nerves were frayed, their bodies weakened by the relentless strain of serving a king whose mental state was deteriorating by the day. Despite all of this, Ferdinand remained convinced that the greatest threat to his rule was not his own body, but the betrayal of those around him. He believed that his enemies, whether they were members of his family, foreign powers, or even the very people who swore loyalty to him, were all conspiring to undermine his throne. His suspicions grew so wild and unfounded that he began to keep lists of suspected traitors, carefully noting every conversation, every glance, every action that seemed out of place. His paranoia became an all-consuming obsession, and the people around him were forced to live in constant fear of being accused of treason. Ferdinand's increasing isolation and paranoia began to affect his political decisions as well. His obsession with his own security, combined with his growing mistrust of those in his inner circle, led to the breakdown of the Spanish monarchy's authority. Ferdinand could no longer govern effectively, as his time was consumed by his irrational fears and obsessions. The kingdom, already weakened by years of misrule and economic instability, began to crumble under the weight of Ferdinand's madness. His obsession with producing an heir, combined with his inability to trust anyone, led to the downfall of his reign. At the same time, Ferdinand's obsession with his own physical condition continued to haunt him. His failure to produce an heir had become a symbol of his weakness, and he could not shake the belief that his body had betrayed him. He became consumed by the idea that his deformity was the root cause of his problems, and he spent hours consulting with physicians, mystics, and astrologers in an attempt to find a solution. Yet, despite all his efforts, nothing could change the truth. Ferdinand's body was incapable of producing an heir, and his obsession with this fact had caused irreparable damage to both his personal life and his reign. As the years passed, Ferdinand's paranoia and desperation only grew stronger. The kingdom that had once been a powerful force in Europe now seemed a shadow of its former self, its fate tied to the whims of a king whose personal failings had become its greatest tragedy. Ferdinand's reign, once marked by grand ambitions and dreams of greatness, had devolved into a nightmare of suspicion, betrayal, and madness. Despite the traumatic demise of his first wife, Maria Antonia, and the deepening psychological turmoil that had come to define his reign, Ferdinand VII remained fixated on the idea of securing an heir. His failure to produce one had consumed him entirely, and the shadow of his deformity continued to hang over every decision he made. It was not merely a personal embarrassment for the king, it was the crux of his power, the justification for his existence as a ruler. His reign had been marked by failure after failure, but in Ferdinand's mind, producing an heir was the one thing that would redeem him, that would allow him to preserve the royal bloodline and, perhaps, restore his lost dignity. With Maria Antonia's death still fresh in his mind, Ferdinand set his sights on a second marriage. He knew that time was running out. His body, aging and still unable to produce an heir, was a constant reminder of the curse that had plagued him since birth. But Ferdinand's obsession with producing a child was undeterred. He viewed marriage not as a union of two souls, but as a political necessity, a means to fulfill his dynastic duty. This time, the choice of a bride was more calculated, more deliberate. Ferdinand's second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, was also his cousin, a typical arrangement in the royal families of Europe. She was 19 years old when she arrived in Madrid, a young woman with the naive hope that marriage to a king would be a grand and romantic affair. But little did she know that she would soon find herself trapped in the same cycle of trauma and humiliation that had defined Ferdinand's first marriage. Maria Isabel, unaware of the full extent of Ferdinand's deformity, arrived at the Spanish court with the usual expectations of royal brides, that marriage to a king would be an idealized, albeit somewhat formal, union. But the reality of Ferdinand's condition quickly became apparent, and what followed was a marriage that resembled not romance but an elaborate medical procedure, a grotesque parody of a wedding night. Ferdinand, unable to accept his condition and desperate to produce an heir, had once again arranged for special preparations in the royal bedchamber. Custom-made cushions, oils, and medical implements were brought in, designed to mitigate the physical challenges that Ferdinand's anatomy presented. The room, which should have been filled with love and excitement, was instead a sterile, clinical environment where the king's intimate duties were reduced to a series of mechanical and painful rituals. Maria Isabel, who had arrived full of youthful optimism, was horrified by what she found in the bridal chamber. The first time she laid eyes on Ferdinand's naked form, her reaction was one of pure terror. According to court observers, she screamed, pointing at her husband and crying, "Monster! Monster!" She retreated to the farthest corner of the room, her face pale with shock, unable to comprehend the horror before her. What followed was an ordeal that would haunt Maria Isabel for the rest of her life. The night, which should have been a tender beginning to a royal union, turned into something far darker. The specially designed cushions and medical devices were employed, and once again, Ferdinand's physicians were summoned to manage what was less a romantic ritual than a grotesque medical procedure. Maria Isabel, overwhelmed by the experience, was given large doses of laudanum to calm her nerves. But the damage had been done. The trauma of the wedding night would stay with Maria Isabel, and the following days were filled with misery and regret. Court physicians noted her increasingly erratic behavior, and soon it became clear that the psychological toll of the marriage was unbearable. The young queen began to suffer from what modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. She experienced nightmares, waking in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, screaming from the horrors she had witnessed in her bridal chamber. Her physical and emotional health rapidly deteriorated under the constant strain. Maria Isabel developed a pronounced stutter and tremors, symptoms of the severe psychological distress she was enduring. The courtiers whispered about her condition, but they knew better than to speak too openly. Ferdinand, meanwhile, remained consumed by his obsession with producing an heir. His growing paranoia about the legitimacy of his union with Maria Isabel began to cloud his judgment. He believed that her emotional distress and apparent revulsion were the reasons they had yet to conceive, and he became more fixated on the idea that she was secretly sabotaging their efforts. As the years passed, Ferdinand's obsession with his wife's behavior grew. He became convinced that she was conspiring against him, that she was secretly working with his political enemies to undermine his rule. His mistrust of her extended beyond the private chambers and into the public sphere. Ferdinand ordered his spies to monitor her movements, to intercept her letters, and to report on her every conversation. He became convinced that the queen was plotting behind his back, whispering with foreign powers, and harboring secret political sympathies. Maria Isabel, already fragile from the trauma of her marriage, was now trapped in a nightmare of surveillance and suspicion. She began to lose her grip on reality, her mind slowly unraveling under the constant pressure of Ferdinand's demands. Her attempts to seek solace in the company of her ladies-in-waiting were thwarted by Ferdinand's spies, who monitored her every interaction, every gesture. She had no escape from the suffocating atmosphere of distrust that Ferdinand had created in the palace. Despite all of this, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir never waned. He continued to order more bizarre medical experiments, convinced that the right treatment would finally solve his problems. His focus remained on his personal failure, his inability to father a child, and he became more isolated from the rest of the world. His reign, once filled with the promise of power and glory, had become a twisted cycle of obsession, desperation, and cruelty. Even as the political landscape of Spain began to deteriorate, its colonies in revolt and its empire crumbling under economic strain, Ferdinand remained locked in his private world, obsessed with one thing: the production of a royal heir. His obsession had taken on a life of its own, and it had consumed not only his relationship with his wife but his ability to govern. The kingdom, once a proud empire, had become a mere backdrop to Ferdinand's personal tragedy. The public, who had once revered him as their king, now saw him as a figure of ridicule, a monarch whose personal failures had come to define his reign. Ferdinand's second marriage to Maria Isabel, like his first, was doomed from the start. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted on his wives, the bizarre and disturbing medical experiments, and his growing paranoia all contributed to the unraveling of his dynasty. The king who had once promised to restore Spain to greatness had instead become a prisoner of his own body, and the future of the Spanish throne seemed more uncertain than ever. Ferdinand's second marriage to Maria Isabel quickly devolved into a tragic farce. His obsession with producing an heir and his deteriorating mental state turned what should have been a union of mutual respect into a battlefield of manipulation, terror, and deceit. The king's inability to recognize the psychological toll of his actions on his wife led to further abuse. Maria Isabel, already traumatized by the horrific wedding night, found herself trapped in a marriage where every aspect of her life was scrutinized and controlled by Ferdinand. Ferdinand's growing paranoia reached new heights as he became more convinced that his wife's unwillingness to conceive was not just a biological issue, but a deliberate attempt to sabotage his legacy. He began accusing her of plotting against him, believing that her failure to bear him a child was a personal betrayal. Ferdinand's accusations were not just limited to their marital relations. He became convinced that Maria Isabel was involved in a broader conspiracy to weaken his rule. His paranoia manifested in increasingly erratic behaviors. Ferdinand ordered his spies to follow the queen wherever she went. Every interaction, every glance, every word spoken in her presence was dissected and reported back to him. His spies infiltrated her private chambers, monitored her conversations with her ladies-in-waiting, and intercepted her letters. Ferdinand believed that she was communicating secretly with foreign powers, perhaps plotting with Spain's enemies to disgrace him or undermine his authority. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Ferdinand had created in the palace was suffocating. Maria Isabel had no safe space. Her every movement was watched, her every word twisted into potential evidence of treason. The emotional strain was unbearable. She began to withdraw into herself, suffering in silence as her once hopeful spirit was crushed by the weight of Ferdinand's cruel demands and unfounded suspicions. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir reached its grotesque apex. He demanded more bizarre medical experiments, hoping that some scientific or mystical solution would finally overcome the physical limitations imposed on him by his condition. Royal physicians were forced to create new, increasingly absurd devices and treatments designed to alleviate the king's anatomical challenges, all while the suffering of his wife continued. The royal court, once a center of culture and diplomacy, became a place of secrets, whispered rumors, and tragic deception. Even those who were closest to Ferdinand and Maria Isabel were left in the dark, uncertain of the true nature of their suffering. The walls of the palace, once filled with the sounds of celebrations and state affairs, now echoed with the whispers of a broken kingdom, one where the king's obsession with his personal tragedy had consumed everything in its path. As the years passed, Maria Isabel's health deteriorated, both physically and mentally. The strain of living under Ferdinand's cruel scrutiny, the constant fear of his accusations, and the trauma of their failed marriage began to take a heavy toll on her body. She became a shadow of the young woman who had arrived at the Spanish court full of hope and anticipation. Her physical appearance began to change. Her once beautiful features became drawn, her skin pale, and her eyes hollow from sleepless nights filled with anxiety. Her body, once full of life, now seemed frail and fragile, a reflection of the emotional and psychological toll that Ferdinand's obsession had taken on her. Her stutter grew more pronounced, and she became prone to sudden fits of hysteria. She often woke in the middle of the night in a panic, her mind trapped in the horrors of her royal duties and the constant fear that Ferdinand would accuse her of betrayal once more. Despite her suffering, Maria Isabel did not have the freedom to seek help. Ferdinand, obsessed with maintaining control over every aspect of her life, would not allow her to seek refuge from the palace. He increased his surveillance, believing that his wife was in contact with foreign agents or that she was hiding something from him. His actions grew more extreme. He ordered her personal maids to report on her every movement, no matter how trivial. He demanded that her meals be tasted, ensuring that no one could poison him through his wife. The psychological toll of this constant surveillance, coupled with the trauma of the marriage, eventually became too much for Maria Isabel. Her health continued to decline, and her dependency on laudanum grew as she sought any way to numb the pain and despair that seemed to envelop her every moment. But even as her health worsened, Ferdinand continued his obsession with the idea of producing an heir. He refused to accept the reality that his physical condition had made it impossible to conceive. By 1818, Maria Isabel's physical and mental collapse had reached its peak. The queen was no longer the vibrant woman who had first arrived at the Spanish court. She had become a shell of herself, a living ghost haunted by the memories of a failed marriage and a future that seemed impossible to attain. Eventually, her body could no longer bear the strain, and in 1818, she died. Officially, her death was attributed to nervous exhaustion, but those close to her knew the truth. She had died of despair, a woman crushed by the unrelenting demands of her husband, whose obsession with his own failure had destroyed both her body and spirit. The circumstances surrounding her death fueled rumors, and whispers began to circulate that Ferdinand himself had played a role in his wife's demise. Some speculated that he had poisoned her, either directly or through his relentless psychological abuse. Others believed that he had driven her to suicide, unable to live with the torment of a marriage that had turned into a nightmare. Regardless of the true cause of her death, one thing was certain. Ferdinand's actions had killed his second wife as surely as if he had struck the fatal blow himself. In the aftermath of Maria Isabel's death, Ferdinand's reign continued to deteriorate. His obsession with producing an heir and his increasingly erratic behavior left Spain in a state of disarray. The royal court was paralyzed by Ferdinand's paranoia, and the kingdom, already crumbling under the weight of political instability and economic decline, was further weakened by the king's inability to rule effectively. Ferdinand, once seen as a ruler who could restore Spain to its former glory, had become a symbol of the kingdom's collapse. With the death of his second wife, Ferdinand's quest for an heir remained unfulfilled. But the king, driven by an all-consuming need to secure his dynasty, quickly set his sights on a third marriage. This time, he was determined to find a woman who would not only fulfill his royal duty but who could survive the ordeal of marrying a man who had already claimed 2 victims. The choice of bride was once again dictated by the needs of the monarchy. The third queen consort of Spain was Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony, a 24-year-old princess who came to Madrid with little more than the hope of securing her family's financial future. Maria Joseph, who had been briefed on Ferdinand's condition before arriving in Spain, was more pragmatic than her predecessors. She knew the challenges she would face and had accepted that her marriage to Ferdinand was not one of romance but of duty. She came prepared with her own set of medical devices and a personal physician who was familiar with difficult royal marriages. This clinical approach, which some might have seen as cold, actually served her better than the naive optimism of Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel. However, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir did not fade. The king, now in his late 40s, was as determined as ever to secure the Spanish throne for his bloodline, despite his advancing age and physical condition. His previous failures had left him both desperate and paranoid, and he approached his marriage to Maria Joseph with a mix of hope and fear. Once again, the wedding night was not a celebration of love or union, but an act of clinical necessity. Ferdinand, still obsessed with his anatomy, insisted on the same elaborate preparations as in his previous marriages: custom-made cushions, oils, and medical implements. But even with all the preparations and devices, the process remained as traumatic as before. Maria Joseph, who had been briefed on the bizarre nature of her royal duties, did her best to endure. But like her predecessors, she too suffered under the weight of Ferdinand's obsession. His desperation to produce an heir, combined with his physical inadequacies, created an atmosphere of tension and fear that permeated every aspect of their marriage. Despite the better understanding she had of the situation, Maria Joseph's role as Ferdinand's queen was still defined by a tragic reality, one in which her body was not her own, but another piece of a royal puzzle that Ferdinand could not solve. As Ferdinand's third marriage to Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony settled into a clinical and emotionally strained routine, his desperate obsession with producing an heir continued to dominate every aspect of his life. However, as the years passed without success, Ferdinand began to face a more terrifying reality. The legitimacy of his bloodline, already tainted by the tragic failures of his previous marriages, was now in serious question. Maria Joseph, though practical and understanding of her role, had come to Madrid with the expectation that her marriage would be a solemn duty rather than a romantic one. She had accepted that her union with Ferdinand was more a political necessity than a personal choice. Yet, despite her pragmatism, the mounting pressure to bear an heir continued to take a toll on her physical and emotional health. It seemed as if no matter how hard she tried, she could not fulfill Ferdinand's ultimate desire. Ferdinand, consumed by his paranoia, began to suspect that the failure to produce an heir was not merely a matter of biology, but one of legitimacy. Deep in his mind, he began to wonder whether the bloodline he was desperately trying to preserve was even his own. This fear was not born of any medical reasoning or evidence, but rather from his own growing self-doubt and the lingering ghost of his deformity, which he believed might have poisoned his royal line. The question of paternity began to haunt him. Maria Joseph, though she had been chosen for her practicality and her understanding of Ferdinand's medical issues, could never escape the fact that her role was reduced to fulfilling a dynastic need. She too was aware of the constant surveillance and pressure, and despite all her efforts to comply, Ferdinand's insecurities remained unshakable. This crisis of legitimacy reached a fever pitch when, after several years of failed attempts to conceive, Maria Joseph became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the Spanish court, as Ferdinand's hope for an heir had been reignited. But even as he celebrated the pregnancy, he could not shake the deepening paranoia that this child might not truly be his. It was a bitter irony for Ferdinand, whose entire life had been consumed by the need to produce an heir. The fact that he could now have one, only to question the child's legitimacy, was a cruel reflection of his distorted worldview. Ferdinand became obsessed with the idea that someone, somehow, was trying to destroy his dynasty. He questioned every detail, every interaction, every conversation, seeking to confirm his worst fears. His paranoia intensified, and he consulted with astrologers, physicians, and anyone who might offer reassurance that his bloodline could still be saved. He demanded tests, investigations, and the constant surveillance of Maria Joseph, convinced that she was either carrying an illegitimate child or had already betrayed him in some unimaginable way. The court, once filled with diplomacy and cultural refinement, had become a dark and dangerous place. The paranoia that gripped Ferdinand infected everyone around him. Court officials, once trusted to carry out the king's commands, now found themselves caught in a web of suspicion and fear. Ferdinand's obsession with the legitimacy of his heir, and by extension, his own rule, led to a breakdown in the normal workings of the court. Ministers were forced to spend their time placating a king whose mind was consumed by his own insecurities, while the kingdom continued to crumble under the weight of its monarch's dysfunction. Ferdinand's mental deterioration reached a point where his reign was no longer about the welfare of Spain, but about his own survival and the preservation of his bloodline. The kingdom that he had inherited, once a mighty empire, was now a fractured, unstable entity. His obsession with producing an heir had become the singular focus of his life, and everything else, the kingdom, his subjects, and even his family, became secondary to this one goal. The paranoia that had initially consumed his personal relationships now extended to the political sphere. Ferdinand no longer trusted anyone, not his ministers, not his courtiers, not even his own family. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. Foreign diplomats who had once been welcomed with open arms now found themselves questioned and surveilled. Ministers who had served Spain loyally for years were suddenly suspected of treason. Even his own daughter, Isabella II, became a source of anxiety for him. Although she was technically his heir, Ferdinand's obsessive need to control everything led him to question her legitimacy. Ferdinand's obsession with his royal bloodline, coupled with his psychological instability, turned him into a tyrant whose rule was defined not by diplomacy or governance, but by fear and manipulation. His paranoia led to the creation of a spy network within the court. He employed an army of informants who reported back on the actions of anyone who might be a threat to his rule. His ministers were instructed to keep detailed records of every courtier's movements and conversations, and any sign of disloyalty, no matter how small, was swiftly punished. Ferdinand's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would burst into the rooms of his ministers unannounced, demanding to know the latest developments in Spain's ongoing political and military struggles. But his questions were often nonsensical. He would ask the same questions over and over, convinced that everyone around him was hiding something. His reign became a game of cat and mouse, where the courtiers and officials were forced to hide their true thoughts and actions, speaking in riddles and avoiding direct eye contact with the king. The fear in the royal court was palpable. No one knew who might be accused of treason next, and no one dared speak their mind in Ferdinand's presence. Even the simplest of interactions were laced with suspicion. Ferdinand's court became a place where silence was the only way to survive, where everyone walked on eggshells, afraid to upset the king's delicate state of mind. Ferdinand had become a king whose paranoia was as dangerous as any external threat. Despite his delusions and his growing isolation, Ferdinand's political machinations continued to wreak havoc on Spain. The kingdom was slipping into chaos, its colonies in revolt, its economy in ruins, and its military stretched thin. Yet, Ferdinand could no longer see the bigger picture. His obsession with producing an heir, with preserving his bloodline, had consumed him entirely. His inability to confront the reality of his situation had rendered him a puppet of his own paranoia, a king whose reign was defined not by strength or wisdom, but by the destruction of his own mind. Spain, a once great empire, now faced an uncertain future under a ruler who could no longer see beyond his own fears. Ferdinand's refusal to accept the reality of his physical condition, combined with his growing mental instability, led to the fracturing of the monarchy. The Spanish people, once proud of their king, now saw him as a figure of ridicule, a monarch whose personal failures had taken precedence over the needs of the kingdom. Ferdinand's reign had become a tragic symbol of how personal dysfunction could metastasize into national disaster. Ferdinand's reign, marked by decades of obsession, paranoia, and failure, finally came to an end in 1833, when the king passed away at the age of 45. His death was not the result of a battle or a political coup, but the culmination of years of physical and psychological decline. The official cause of death was listed as gout, but the truth was far darker. Ferdinand had spent his final years consumed by the pressures of his own mind, his body worn down by a lifetime of sexual dysfunction, emotional trauma, and paranoid delusions. Ferdinand's death was a relief to many in Spain, who had endured years of instability and suffering under his rule. The country was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered monarchy, and the future of the Spanish crown seemed uncertain. Ferdinand's passing marked the end of an era, one that had been defined not by great achievements or triumphs, but by personal failings and destructive obsessions. His legacy, rather than being remembered for any noble accomplishment, would be one of tragedy, paranoia, and the lasting damage wrought by his inability to confront the realities of his condition. The autopsy of Ferdinand, conducted in secret by his physicians, revealed the full extent of his deformity. His anatomical condition was far worse than anyone had imagined, with his member measuring an astounding 14 inches in length, a grotesque reflection of the genetic lottery gone wrong. The medical reports also revealed signs of self-inflicted injury, suggesting that Ferdinand had attempted various forms of surgery on himself in a desperate bid to correct his condition. These attempts had only made his problems worse, adding layers of psychological trauma to his already tormented soul. Ferdinand's death did not mark the end of his dynasty, but it did signify the beginning of a new chapter for Spain. His daughter, Isabella II, ascended to the throne, though her reign would be marked by political instability, civil war, and the continued fallout from Ferdinand's destructive legacy. Spain, once a powerful empire, had been left with a broken monarchy, a fractured country, and a legacy tarnished by the personal failures of a king who had obsessed over his own deficiencies to the detriment of his kingdom. Ferdinand's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the corrosive effects of personal dysfunction, and the tragic consequences of a ruler who allowed his most intimate failures to determine the fate of a nation. His reign, though marked by cruelty and paranoia, also serves as a reminder that the personal flaws of a leader can have far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of history in ways that are often too painful to fully comprehend. Thank you for watching the story of the cursed king, Ferdinand VII, a journey full of pain and unimaginable tragedies. If you found this story interesting and want to uncover more hidden historical truths, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts below. Your support means a lot and motivates me to keep bringing you engaging content. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video.